to spend some time today talking self-storage, specifically how we value self-storage facilities. So I'm going to use an example of a property that I have under contract down in North Carolina. You can see, and you might have seen some videos on the Facebook page about this facility in the forest. There are 4 buildings here totaling 12,000 square feet. And I don't know how this came to be, but they were basically built, from what I can tell, looking at the records, about 10 years ago, and then the parking lot was never installed. I suspect that the fact that the gentleman who owned this property at the time died right around that time, it probably fell into some sort of probate and then just got forgotten forever. And so there are trees that are 20, 25 feet tall all surrounding that property. And if you've seen any of those videos on Facebook, you know what I'm talking about. But we have this under contract, and we're going to be purchasing it later, probably next month, as we wait for some town approvals. And what I want to review with you today is just kind of use this as an example so that you can learn a little bit about how we value these properties, how we determine, what they're worth as they sit, what they'd be worth if they were operating optimally. And then also, we use that information to determine what we can pay based on the type of return that we expect on our money if I'm working with investors. So in this case, we're going to be, and I apologize for boring you with spreadsheets, but this is a numbers game, and so that's what we do. If you look here in column B, this is the as-is condition of the property, and it's basically this gray section is a snapshot of the income and expenses of the property. If the property were fully rented at the rates that I'll review with you in a minute, it would bring in $63,000. And then these are expenses because this property is not currently operating. It's completely vacant and there's nothing happening. These numbers are my best guesses based on what I know about industry standards. We just use a percent of the gross revenue, and then also we adjust that up or down based on the specifics to the property. There are rules of thumb, and some of those are applied here. Others we're just guessing. Others, if you look at the property taxes, that's a known number. Utilities and internet, we base that on experience and best guesses. If we're purchasing a property that's currently in operation, clearly we're going to get from the seller or the agent this expense information, and we're going to put in actual numbers. This one's a little funky, so clearly I can't do that. But let's back up and start at the gross revenue. This is the amount of money that the property is capable of bringing in if it were fully occupied. And so I've got another sheet here where I simply just list out the number of units, the size of the units, meaning the dimensions, 5 by 10, 10 by 10, etc. This will then automatically calculate for me the square footage of the unit, and these are the prices that we anticipate to be able to charge, the market rents for each unit. And those obviously came from doing market research, seeing what competitors are charging, factoring in where we stand geographically. For example, if we're a little further away, we might need to drop our prices to be a little below them to entice people to drive the extra half mile or mile to come see us and that sort of thing. And then the spreadsheet's just going to calculate the total revenue. And we've also got the total square feet just as a double check to make sure, okay, all these formulas that are embedded in here, do they come out to the 12,000 square feet, which we know exists at the property? And fortunately it does. So what that gives us is that total revenue number. And similarly, it's going to give us what we call the average move-in value. So this just takes the average size unit and the average dollar amount we get for that unit. And so anytime someone moves in, the average increase in revenue we're going to experience is roughly $55. And you'll see why that's important as I switch over to the second spreadsheet. This is what I call the ramp up spreadsheet. And it just means that we want to see how our revenue will increase month over month, year over year. And so the assumption I made here was 3 net move-ins per month, which a net move-in, sometimes I get asked about that, simply means if 5 people move in and 2 people move out, then net increase in people staying with us is 3. And so that's a relatively good number. It's a very conservative number to work with. Clearly, it's going to be market dependent. All of the facilities I've bought in the past have increased at a net move-in rate of 8 net move-ins per month or better. That being said, I am an under promise, over deliver kind of guy. And so I dumb this down to basically the worst case scenario. In this instance, my thought process was, all right, well, I can probably get 6 to 8 net move-ins a month, but that would be best case scenario. Let's see worst case scenario. If only half of those people move in, say 3 per month, is this still a deal? And that's how I determine it, because anything above and beyond the 3 net move-ins would just be icing on the cake. So very simply, 3 people moving in the first month, our revenue for that month is going to be $165 more than it was before. Again, this is us starting at zero. Oftentimes, when you're buying an existing facility, you'll have a number in this month one that's the current revenue. And clearly that is to your benefit when there's existing income with the property. In this instance, we don't have it, so we started at zero and we add $165 every month. So you can see at the end of year one, we've brought in just under $13,000. End of year two, $37,000, and end of year three, we get all the way up to greater than 90% of our expected. Remember, 60,000 out of the 63,000. So we were not going to use this exact number, and I'll show you that in a moment. Back to our main spreadsheet, what we're looking at here is, again, the as is, there's no money coming in. We will have expenses in year one, which are shown here. And so we're just going to transcribe those revenue numbers. In the first month, we said just under 13 grand. We're going to have these expenses anticipated. Now, the management and payroll is something that I may take on myself initially, but you still want to incorporate that cost in there. I don't anticipate needing an employee at this location, but I will need some boots on the ground. And I will be doing some traveling to and from. I'm in New York, this property's in North Carolina. So this $6,000 during the first year, although I won't have someone on payroll per se, I need these funds, one, to get me back and forth to North Carolina, and two, to pay whoever my boots on the ground is. Remember, my remote management strategy has an online portal for rentals and payments, a call center, as well as somebody, and it doesn't need to cost nearly $6,000 a year for this person because the tasks they do are relatively limited. It could conceivably be half of that at $3,000 a year, a couple $100 a month, $250 a month for a small facility like this is definitely adequate, especially if I'm combining those tasks with a service maybe that they're already offering me, like lawn mowing, or not in North Carolina, but up north, snow plowing, that sort of thing. So bottom line is, year one, this isn't all that exciting. We bought a property, we bring in 13 grand. After all of our expenses, we're paying out 22 grand. That leaves us a net operating income, which is defined as the revenue left after you pay your day-to-day operational expenses. The only thing not included in that calculation is debt service, and you'll see, and we'll talk about that a little bit more down below. So this net negative of $8,500 is before I have to pay debt service. So if I had a loan on this property, once I buy it, my negative will get bigger. Clearly, in this case, I've already punched in, you'll see here, a $3,200 expense for debt service. The way this deal is working is I'm buying it with seller financing. I'm putting $35,000 down, and they're holding a note of $75,000 at 7% principal and interest over 25 years. When you do the math using an amortization calculator, which you can just pull up on Google and type in, $75,000, 7%, 25 years, it'll show you that over the course of a year, you're going to spend $6,360, which is 12 monthly payments at $530 per month. Now, the reason that in year one I have it at half that is because I did negotiate with the seller to provide me with 6 months, no interest, no payments up front, so that I have some time to get this place up and running. And it just makes it a little more palatable, less negative cash flow during the first 12 months. But knowing this is important, this negative $12,000 means I have to set that money aside at the beginning to make sure that I don't end up in a cash flow crunch down the road. When we move over to year two, again, I'll switch back quickly to our month-by-month ramp up. The cumulative increases in monthly rents result in just under $37,000 in revenue during the second 12 months of ownership. And so we've got that roughly $37,000 here. Our expenses again, and we've now got a total expenses and then a net operating income of $15,000 a year. Again, not all that exciting, especially because we have to take out the debt service, and now we're down to $9,000 in profit after 2 years. Not all that exciting. You might be tempted to say this isn't a deal, but remember, delayed gratification is where real wealth is built. And so if we look at the first 2 years, we've got negative 11,000, positive 9,000. I'm talking about investing the next 24 months of my life to lose $2,000. Clearly, if that's where it ended, this would not be a deal and we'd move on to something else. But year three starts to get a little better. Again, this is a small deal. It's not a home run, get rich, and it's not retirement money. I'll put it that way for most folks, though it is not anything to sneeze at either. And let's look at it. What I did here is I used just under $57,000 in rent. If you look at my formula, the reason is I took the gross rent and then put in a 10% vacancy factor. So this is assuming we can get up to 90% occupied. This is the revenue out of the $63,000 that we would actually collect. Anywhere from 85 to 88% is considered stable, stabilized, and is an industry standard. So I might be being a little aggressive using 90% instead of 88%, but it's a nice round number. And the truth be told is if 2% is going to make the difference in deal or no deal, then these margins are too tight anyways, and I should move on. But when we do the math here, or I let the spreadsheet do the math, we've got our expenses. Again, they're relatively flat, and you'll notice I want to draw your attention to this number, $22,000, is right around 30 to 35% of the gross revenue. And that's a good rule of thumb. I find I can operate facilities between 25 and 30% because I've got a pretty good streamlined system for doing so. But the rule of thumb, and what I would encourage you to use as you're looking at properties, is to use 33%. It's right in the middle of the industry average, and it makes for easy math. You just take the the gross revenue and eliminate a third of it to cover your operating expenses. Then what you have left over is your net operating income, and you'll pay your debt service out of that. What's left after that is your profit. So here we go, $63,000, roughly a third of 21 and change is going to give us the net operating income of just under 35 grand. Now, that's a whole lot better than it used to be. And we'll look, once we take out debt service, we've got cash flow or profits during the third year of just over $28,000. Now, again, if we look at these three cumulatively and go, well, we lost $2,000 in the first 2 years, and then we made 28, call it, we're roughly 25, 26 grand on the right side of zero. But for 3 years effort, even though most of the effort's up front and then a lot of it's just, a couple hours a week of maintenance, on average, we're making 8 grand a year over 3 years. Not a whole lot to get excited about, but here's where the power comes in. Storage facilities are valued based on the income they generate, largely. So the more revenue they bring in, the more profits they bring in, the more money someone is clearly going to pay you to buy that storage facility. Now, this is a very generic statement, but I like to use a multiple of 10 as a valuation metric. And this number can vary widely in metropolitan areas, densely populated primary Class A facilities in primary markets. You might be paying a multiple of 20 to buy a storage facility. That's a 5 cap, a cap rate of 5. You can look that up, or maybe I'll do another video explaining cap rate in a little more detail. But here I used a 10 cap, which means we're going to take the net operating income and multiply by 10 to get a valuation. That's a good average number. Again, it varies widely, could be as many as multiple of 20. In the markets I work in, secondary, tertiary markets tend to be on the outskirts of even suburbia and more rural. We're looking at cap rates between 8 and 12, 8.5, 7.5 and 12.5, maybe if it is more suburban and less rural. But the average is 10, and so that's what we're going to use here for simple math. It's just to get the concept straight in all our heads. So if we take the net operating income and multiply by 10, this property is now worth $350,000. We've paid down some of our mortgage over time, which is $72,000. And if you'll remember, this property, and I should have been more clear about this early on, I'm taking the seller financing, putting 35 grand down, and taking the seller financing of 75,000. I'm also putting another $65,000 in of my own money to tear down the trees, put in the gravel, put up a fence, install my remote operating systems, all of that stuff. So I'm going to be 100 grand out of pocket on this deal. And that's important to know. So as we calculate our return on investment, you'll see whether or not this is a good use of our money. One of the mistakes I see folks make early on, though, is taking this value. Oh, it's 350. Mike put 100 grand in. He owes the seller 70 grand, so he's made 180, right? 350 minus the 70 that I still owe brings us down to 280, minus the 100 that I put in, I've got a profit of 180. The one big missing link there is the cost to sell. Now, it is possible that you might be fortunate enough, especially in a hot market like today, where you can sell a storage facility without representation of a broker, but I wouldn't count on that ever. And so I use a cost to sell of 8%. That covers brokerage fees as well as closing costs and that sort of thing. And so you want to pull that out as well. When you do that, and I apologize, these numbers really shouldn't be there because there was no investor in this case. I'm going to quickly see. Whoopsies. Bear with me. Proceeds from the sale are going to be value minus mortgage balance minus cost to sell, $248,000. And then we're going to take that number, subtract out our original principal contribution, which is the money I put in, the 100 grand, and my profits from the sale of this property at the end of year 3 are projected to be just under 150 grand. Okay, and then we're going to add that number if we want to look at the total income associated with 3 years of ownership of this property. We're going to look at the 28 grand plus the 87 minus the 11.6, and again, I'm just going to ballpark that and call it 26 grand in profit plus the 148 in profit, and we're looking at somewhere around $174,000 in total profit on a 3-year ownership and a sale of this property. And I think that's, again, going back, pretty conservative. We use 3 net move-ins a month. It very well could be 4, 5, 6 net move-ins a month, and if that happens, these numbers will be largely the same as far as the amount of money we generate, but it'll happen over a quicker period of time, so our return on investment of the 100 grand will be better. I'm going to try this, and I don't really know. But just generically speaking, over the 3 years, if we turn 100 grand, see what happens. I'm just guessing at a 40% return. $275. So we're going to be at 250, remember? So we're not quite at a 40% return, but ballparking it, we're probably looking at a 35-ish% return on investment. And clearly there's going to be some work involved. So if I'm not, I need to at least consider the value of my time that I'm spending on executing this plan. And I've clearly done that. That's why we're moving forward. But, this is the nuts and bolts of valuation that we use. We could get a lot more complicated. One of the lines I skipped over here is debt coverage ratio. This is a number that investors or bankers are going to want to know about. Essentially, it's the relationship between your net operating income and the amount of debt service you have. And typically speaking, a debt coverage ratio of 1.3 or better in the storage industry is going to be enough to get conventional financing. And banks will look past, this would be a hard one to finance conventionally, but it's certainly possible, especially if you have some experience. But at 1.3 or better, you're going to be within the good graces of most banks. You'll see these numbers even at year 2, when we're only bringing in a little over half the revenue that we should be bringing in. Because our debt service is so low, our ratio is very high, 2.37, as well as in year 3, even higher, 5.5. The reason is because I'm putting $100,000 down in cash and only have a loan of 75 grand with relatively modest payments. When you're looking at properties where you're putting 10, 15, 20% down, and then the debt service is on an amount of 80% loan to value, those debt coverage ratios are going to be much closer to the 1.3 range. So hopefully that all makes sense. Again, the basic things we're doing is taking the number of units and the rent that comes from those units to get our gross revenue. We also want to divide that gross revenue by 12 to get a monthly revenue, which is right here, and then divide that by the number of units to get an average move-in value. That allows us to calculate our ramp-up revenue, which we can then carry over to the income and expense page to do this valuation. Again, this can get a lot more complicated down here. The debt service, especially if you have equity investors who are entitled to a portion of the cash flow, then you're going to need to, though that's not technically debt, it does need to be factored in as a line item out. Otherwise, if you don't factor in paying for that each month, you could end up on the wrong side of zero more often than you can tolerate. So hopefully that all makes sense. I'm happy to answer any questions, so feel free to comment below if you want to check us out. You may have found us here on YouTube or over on Facebook. It's #StorageRebellion or our website, thestoragerebellion.com. And yeah, like I said, put comments in. I'm happy to answer them, and we could take it from there. Thanks, guys.